On a windswept headland north of Sydney, the Pacific crashes into a rock funnel called Snapper Point. Hikers come for the view. One morning, they saw a body. What looked like a tragic fall wasn't nature. It was a plan. A plan that started in a quiet apartment in Campsie, with a message from someone she trusted. And years later, a small weatherproof USB would surface in the most unlikely place, revealing exactly how calculated it all was. We'll come back to that USB and why it still haunts this case. Her name was Michelle Leng, an only child from Chengdu, China, who moved to Australia in 2011 to study. She finished a business degree at UTS and later enrolled at the Sydney Institute of Interpreting and Translating. Friends called her gentle, determined, and quietly ambitious. She sent spare money home to her mother, May, and shared a Campsie apartment with her aunt, her cousin, and her aunt's husband, Derek Barrett. It felt safe, family, routine, the kind of place where you kick off your shoes and scroll your phone. That sense of safety, of trust, would become the center of the story. It was a warm Thursday. Michelle met friends near Pitt Street Mall in the afternoon, then went browsing alone. Later, she boarded a train at St. James Station, arriving at Campsie around 4:30 p.m. She messaged friends into the late afternoon, then went quiet. No replies, no new posts, no sign of her on campus the next morning. Days passed. Her aunt came home from a weekend away and realized Michelle was missing, heading straight to the police with Derek to file a report. CCTV from the city showed Michelle calm and unhurried, in a gray top and jeans, a red bag on her shoulder. Nothing in the footage suggested fear. Nothing about her day stood out, until she vanished. Meanwhile, over an hour away on the Central Coast, rangers and emergency crews were responding to another call. At Snapper Point, a tourist peered down into the surge and saw a woman face down. A helicopter crew recovered her. She was young, with shoulder-length dark hair. She'd been stripped of clothing and jewelry. The injuries told investigators this wasn't an accident. Dozens of stab wounds and a fatal cut to the throat. With no ID, police released a composite image of the Snapper Point Jane Doe. Online, people connected the sketch to a missing student from Campsie. DNA confirmed what friends feared. It was Michelle. Once the victim was identified, the timeline tightened. Detectives widened the circle around Michelle's life. Apartment, family, phone records, vehicles. Looking for a fracture that could explain how a student shopping in the CBD ended up at a perilous blowhole before dawn. Modern homicide investigations rarely hinge on one smoking gun. They're built from routine data that refuses to agree with a lie. In Michelle's case, 3 threads aligned. CCTV and building access showed movements in and around the Campsie apartment that didn't fit the household's usual patterns. Phone metadata placed key devices together when they shouldn't have been, and then far from home at the worst possible time. Vehicle traces matched a late-night city-to-coast route consistent with a drive to Snapper Point, leaving in darkness, returning before morning. Search warrants turned the apartment into a witness, cleaned surfaces that still fluoresced, fibers where they shouldn't be, and, on a device associated with Derek Barrett, images of Michelle bound and gagged on her bed, duct tape across her mouth, terror frozen in her eyes. Investigators believed she'd been lured home under the pretext of a family emergency, then restrained and assaulted in her own room. At some point across that long weekend, Michelle was stabbed to death. Early on April 24th, her killer wrapped her in plastic, drove north, stopped for snacks, continued into the coastal reserve, and threw her over the cliff into the churning water below. Police arrested Derek Barrett, the same man who stood beside the family to report Michelle missing. In interviews and early hearings, he struggled to account for the gaps. Later, he would claim a drug-blurred memory, something the court would ultimately reject. 18 months later, Barrett pleaded guilty. Prosecutors outlined a pattern, an escalating, sexualized obsession, a fabricated emergency to isolate Michelle, methodical control behind a closed door, a midnight drive to a remote cliff, and deliberate attempts to wipe digital traces. The judge described the murder as a despicable crime of extreme brutality and great wickedness, committed by a man in a position of trust in a place that should have been safe. Barrett was sentenced to 46 years, with a non-parole period of 34 years. He would be an old man before any prospect of release. For Michelle's mother, May, the sentence could never answer the question that followed her across oceans. Why? There was grief, and there was finality, or so it seemed. Years later, 2019, an elderly, housebound woman with dementia sat at her kitchen table holding a small, weatherproof USB her daughter said she'd never seen before. Inside were videos and images of unspeakable abuse. Barrett filming himself raping and torturing Michelle while she was bound, hands tied so tightly they'd swollen and turned purple. At one point, cutting tape away with a large knife, retying her wrists and saying chillingly, "Now, where were we?" There were also voyeuristic recordings of Michelle and of Barrett's stepdaughter sleeping and showering. Some files matched items Barrett had deleted from his phone days before his arrest. The woman with the USB had no known connection to him. She lived only a few miles from a house he once occupied. How the device traveled to her table remains a loose thread. The discovery triggered 17 additional charges, including aggravated sexual assault and indecent assault. Barrett pleaded guilty again. Because the murder sentence had already been imposed, the judge treated the new evidence as aggravating facts across a separate set of offenses, 20 more years, but concurrent with the original term. The non-parole period increased by 2 years, pushing earliest eligibility from 2050 to 2052. Snapper Point was supposed to erase the crime. Instead, it returned the story. Data points that most of us ignore, camera timestamps, phone pings, toll crossings, payment receipts, formed a map the killer couldn't control. The apartment spoke, the timeline held, and the ocean gave Michelle back so the evidence could speak for her. This case is about a betrayal that lived inside a family home. It's about ordinary technology, USBs, phones, cameras, becoming witnesses when people can't. Above all, it's about Michelle Leng, a devoted daughter who crossed a continent to build a life, only to be harmed where she should have been safest. Remember her for who she was, not only for what was done to her.